Hey everybody and welcome back. We're going to go through another programming video. Today we're going to be talking a lot about the this keyword. And for this example we're going to be using this sample circle.java and the circle driver.java. I think it was used a little bit in the text. I kind of just wrote it myself, and so it might be slightly different. But like everything else, I think it's important before we try and look at the code to understand what's going to be happening, and then we can walk back through the code and we'll understand what's happening. So I'm going to jump over to PowerPoint here. I just kind of have two slides, so don't get too worried. This is the analogy that I found making the most sense of trying to understand classes, objects, and instances of those classes. And it's the cookie cutter analogy. So the cookie cutter, we can think of it like our class. Our class defines how our cookies are going to look, right? Every cookie in this instance is going to have this nice heart shape. And we can think about that as every object we create has a set of methods that go with it. When we use our cookie cutter, we can create new cookies. We create an instance of the cookie. Well, what is an instance? An instance is an individual representation of that thing. In which case, our cookie cutter, we can create an instance of a cookie. Now, when we use our classes, we can create an instance of a class. And then we have to remember that the variables we create are then going to refer to a particular instance. So let's say I'm using my cookie cutter and I'm cutting a new cookie. I can then call that cookie C1. And when I say C1 whatever, and I can access the values of it, I know I'm referring to C1. Okay, so what does this have to do with the this keyword? When I'm looking at a particular cookie instance, when I'm within the methods of that cookie, or in this case, when I'm looking at an object, and I'm looking within the methods when I'm using a particular instance of that, the this keyword lets me access the values associated with that particular instance. What does all that mean? It means when I'm within the class associated with the object, so every cookie cutter is going to give us some properties. Within the cookie, we want to be able to access values. Well, this cookie has values, this cookie has values, and this cookie has values. So how do I make sure I'm using the correct one? And that's what the this keyword does. It means when we're within a method of our object that's based on it because of the class, when we're within that, we use the this keyword to talk about this instance of our class. And because of that, we can then access the values associated with this. It is a bit confusing at first, and so I'd take a second to think about this cookie cutter analogy. We create instances, which are objects. We create instances from our class. Our class defines how our objects are going to look, what they can store, what they can do. Within each of the objects, they can then have whatever values we associate with that particular instance. So let's jump over to the code and see how this makes any sense. Okay, the basic stuff, I'm going to talk about the class first. We have a circle class. It has a radius value that's stored in it. We have a single constructor. The constructor lets us pass a radius to it, and then we'll set this radius equal to it. That means when we create an instance, because that's what we use the constructor for, to create an instance of the class, that particular instance will have some radius, and we're passing it a radius, and we'll save that radius. Then we can also get the area, and I kind of set it up so that we can see the calculation first before we return it. So that's the class. Then let's look at the driver class for it. So we have the kind of the main class for storing the data, accessing, manipulating. Then we have the class for running it and seeing if it works. In this case, we're going to be creating two circles, circle 1 and circle 2, with radius 1 and 2 respectively. From there, I'm going to get the area, and then we'll print it out. But when we step through this code, hopefully you can start to see a bit of why this keyword is needed. Because when we traverse through the code, when I call c1.getArea, I have to jump to the circle class. But if I'm in the circle class, it doesn't technically define what the radius value is. It's defined in this particular instance that we're talking about. And that's why this keyword is necessary. When I jump from this file to this file, we need something to make sure that the data that we've set up remains intact and that it's passed from one to the other. And that's what this keyword is helping us do. This keyword lets us access the data that refers to a particular instance, and we're going to be able to access it within the methods of that class. So I set a breakpoint for the very first line, and we can step through it. And we'll start off by looking at the constructor, and then we'll look at the constructor again. We'll run through the get area. We'll get to run through it a second time. And hopefully by the end of it, it'll make a little bit more sense. So let's start the debugger. Yes, I want to switch. Okay, what do we have here? Let's move this window out of the way. Perfect. Okay, so we're at the first line. Nothing's happened yet. And we hit a breakpoint. Oh, actually, I stopped the debugging session by accident. Okay, so we can do that. Let's go back here. So we've started our debugging session. I'm going to step into our constructor here. And so what we would expect is we should start going over to the constructor's code. We're going to run through it line by line. We will pass it a radius of 1, and then we're going to set the instance of the radius value. Remember that we're now thinking about the radius that's referred to in the class itself. We're going to set that radius equal to whatever was passed. So let's step into it and see where we go. So we start in our constructor. This next step might be a little confusing. We jump into the object class, because if you remember, everything is technically, a subclass of that. It's inherited from the object, but that's not important right now. So let's just step return and jump back to our constructor we made. And now we can look over at the debugger variables, and this is where maybe we can start to see what's making sense. So right now, we're creating C1. And we're doing this by creating a new instance of the circle class. So right now, the radius, which we have passed, is 1. But you'll see this keyword now shows up. This keyword referring to the instance of the class that we're creating right now. Remember that the circle class itself is only defining what things we can do, but it's not going to tell us a particular instance. So if we look at the instance that we're working with right now, it doesn't have the radius set up yet. Right? We haven't set this .radius equal to anything. The current object we're working with, the current instance of the circle class, doesn't have the radius set yet. We're about to set it up. And so when I run the step into method, now the this.radius is set to 1, which is the value that was passed to us. So the instance we just created, which now, think about it, we're going to be jumping back to our class, our circle driver. We're going to be setting C1 equal to that particular instance. So now what we would hope to see is that when we jump back, C1, it'll probably show up over here. We can do C1 and look at the drop down and see a radius value with 1 stored in it. And so let's see if that's what happens. Let's step return. And so now it's going to set it. Perfect. So C1, we can see radius is within it, and it was set to 1. So now when we think about it, C1.radius, which we can't technically access because remember this is private, but we could do C1.getArea, and when we think about that, it's going to be using the radius value associated with the instance. And I think this will make more sense when we have a second instance created, which is what this next line here is going to do. C2, we're going to create a new instance of the circle class, this time with a radius of 2. So let's step inside. So now we're going to jump over to the constructor. Notice, let's think about before we try and look at the code. We would hope right now that this current instance, because we're creating a new instance, it shouldn't have the radius value set up yet. And so if I go into this drop down here, radius is set to 0 because we haven't set it correctly yet. That's the whole point of this. And so now hopefully the next step, I believe, we're going to drop into this. It's not important. Let's return back. This dot radius, which is the particular instance we're talking about, is set to 0 right now, and if we step, it'll be set to 2. Now the other thing here, what is going on? I clicked on the this, and then it gave me this weird string. This is kind of, if you remember when we brought up the cookie clutter and analogy, we have the memory as our dough. This is kind of telling us a bit about where it is in memory. And so when we jump back, we actually should be able to see C1 and C2 are located in different pieces of memory because they're referencing different pieces of memory. So we've set up our new instance of our circle. So now when we jump back, we should be able to see 2 circle instances, each one having different data within it. And then we have to think, how are we going to access that data when we're within a getArea method? So let's step back, let's jump, step return, and let me do another step. And so now we have C1 and C2. I can click on them. Circle 1 is at some location, and circle 2 is at a totally different one. But if I drop into both of them, I should see a different radius value because we instantiated them with a different value. So when we do the getArea method, when we call it, and we're about to call it for C1, we are going to be jumping into the getArea method. And just like during the constructor, how are we going to access that radius data that we've saved in our instance? And that's what this keyword is set up to do. When we call the getArea method and we jump into this code, this keyword is going to allow us to access the particular instance that we're talking about when the code is running. So let's jump in and see what happens. When I jump in, so we were at this line, we called getArea with C1, which means in this instance, I can actually see the data it's referencing is the same location. And when I click in this dropdown, we should see that this dot radius is the instance that we're talking about in our main method. And then we can access that data that we've stored already within the class. Even though the class, obviously, we technically haven't set the radius in this class yet. We set it in a particular instance in our driver class, and we can then access it with the this keyword. So let's step through this. Now that we've gotten the data, I can step through it, create an area, and then it should return it. And when we return it, now we can see area C1 is set to it. And if I jump into this other method with a different instance, C2.getArea is a different, it's going to be the same method, but a different instance is being used of the circle class. C2 is being used. So when we use this dot radius here, we should be referencing C2's data. And let's step in and see what happens. So if I go into the method, we started with C2.getArea. So we're talking about the C2 instance. And C2's data, it should have a radius of 2 stored in it. So this dot radius is 2. And so then when we go through this, we can calculate the area, return it, and hopefully we should see area C2 is whatever that value is, and then I can finish running out the program. And there it is. We calculated it, and we stepped through to understand why this keyword was necessary. So that's everything I have here. I hope it was helpful, and I'll see you guys in the next one.